Welcome, welcome. Thanks for being here again. You are here with Land Justice Futures for our conversation about Jubilee. This is Right Relations and a Hard Reset, the radical roots of Jubilee and its medicine for these times. And we're here with our friends and partners, Pat McCabe and Ian Schiffer. We ask that you please hold our other friend who was going to be here, Ashley Detar Burt, and her wife Emily, and their baby in your hearts. They are requesting the power of prayer from all corners, friends and strangers, after their baby was born 4 months early just this last weekend, and continues to survive, but is in need of deep care and prayer. So thank you for doing that. And Ashley, you're on our hearts and on our minds, as is your family. If you're new to Land Justice Futures, we are an organization committed to liberating land and relationships from colonial constraints in service of life. We work with movement partners and religious communities to create land transitions centered on racial and ecological healing, and currently work with 19 communities of women religious across the country in a multi-year journey of repair and possibility with the properties they currently own and the communities around them. Today, we are going to discuss some of the biblical lineage that can resource us for the important work of repair and reparations, wealth redistribution, and rematriation of land, Jubilee. This is a tradition that calls for us to flip the tables and create an economic reset to realign our relationships as kin. While not without its contradictions and problematic elements, what it calls for is remarkable. Forgiving all debt, freeing the enslaved, returning land to those who were original inhabitants, and also returning to and being accountable for our families and lineages. Jubilee shows us a biblical tradition created to prevent the accumulation of wealth and the attachment to land ownership. And many Christians believe that this Hebrew tradition was the root stock that informed Jesus's revolution. As many of you know, we've got a lot of sisters on the call. In the Catholic Church, 2025 is a Jubilee year where the faithful are called to spiritual renewal. And my question for today is, how can these more radical elements of this tradition become animated and alive and prioritized in this celebration? It's also a strange time to be in celebration, in the story of the world and the story of the lands that many of us live on and occupy. And throughout my time in building a relationship with sisters, I often hear and get to share in the reflection of what is enough, and having a commitment to not having more than enough is very aligned with the spirit of Jubilee. So we'll look at the roots of this tradition and how it's being practiced by some amazing folks across the country, and what Jubilee invites us into today. And we do that in the hopes that this may be an important source of wisdom and strength in the work of repair, of right relations, and collective liberation. So with that, I'd like to bring up our speakers for today. We have Pat McCabe, who many of you know, and Ian Schiffer. I'll just share a little bit about both. Pat McCabe, Woman Stands Shining, is a Diné mother, grandmother, activist, artist, writer, ceremonial leader, and very much an important advisor and auntie to Land Justice Futures. And if you've been with us, you've likely heard Pat speak many times, and we are so grateful for her wisdom. throughout our journey, and also brings specific wisdom around Jubilee, as someone who's been involved in some projects focused on Jubilee. And Ian Schiffer is another guest and friend of ours today. This was his first time speaking with Land Justice Futures, so I'm excited to introduce him more fully. Ian is an activist and ritualist, a resource mobilizer of Ashkenazi descent, born and raised in Tongva land in LA, and does a lot of work in decommodifying land and returning land where they live, and is a legal apprentice with the Land Clinic. So supporting the release of resources and return, while also growing a lot of relationship with the community of creation there where he lives. And there's more I could say about Ian, but we'll keep it short there. Thank you both for being here. I'd love to start just by asking both of you, and I can share some of my own experience and study of Jubilee as well. But what do you understand Jubilee to be, and what has it meant in your personal life or your vocational life, your organizing life? We can start there with your relationship with this topic. And who wants to go first?
I guess I could go first. Thank you, first of all, Sarah. Thank you, Land Justice Futures, and thank you, Ian, for being a part of this conversation. And definitely prayers out to the family that who also intended to contribute here. I got a lot of friends also joining us, so greetings to you. Um, well, I had a vague concept of Jubilee as a biblical sort of concept, from my grandparents and parents were taken into the Dutch Christian Reformed missionary residential boarding schools when they were very young. Many of you know that as my history, and so I was also raised in the Dutch Christian Reformed Church, and so it was very 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 lightly touched on in that circumstance, and so I had some awareness of it. But then I ended up being invited to a community that was interested in the study of reimagining money and protecting the sacred. And the name they chose for themselves was Jubilee. Because, and my sense about that was because the concept of Jubilee, I mean, one, it was invoking something, saying, hey, we're not the only ones who've had this idea about reimagining money. We've had this kind of radical concept, certainly radical by today's standards, at another time of considering what kind of relationship can we have with money, with possession, with all of these things, right? And then I guess even just the course of that community and how it has shifted. It originally was started out as one community, and then there became two areas of focus. One was on justice, and one was specifically on money. So justice definitely can incorporate many aspects of money and the way we think about money, our beliefs about around money, our co-creation with money. But Jubilee Gift was about really going into the study of the money. And even now in the organization, because it's such a, I always say money's funny. We have interesting, deep, emotional, primal feelings and thoughts and inherited teachings around money. And so there's lots of different ways and lots of different, I guess I'll say willingness to look at different aspects of the history of money and how money and power and land have moved. And so even now we're kind of moving into other little groupings within reimagining money and protecting the sacred. So that's, I think, when I really began to think about that concept of and especially this idea that I mean, on one level, you can look at it like, so you're building 50 years, and then you know it's coming. Like if you live in a society that where everybody's going along with this is a mutual agreement, and then something's going to radically shift. So I was thinking about that this morning. Like there's this interesting time aspect in there, isn't there? About building and about accumulating, but knowing that at some point it's going to shift, right? But I'll also say for myself, um, that in a way I'm a part of a Jubilee uh, impetus in the sense that I am stewarding a land return, a land reunion, as my Hawaiian relatives like to call it, and that came about because there were certain people. Well, the land became available, and that would give my people ceremonial access to a sacred site. But then there were partners who came along and who said, you know, we know that our wealth came from oil, timber, and land theft. The primary partners in this, and we don't feel right about that. And so they're actually doing some very active work spiritually, ceremonially, as well as in, I guess you could say, in the concrete modern world place as well, to shift that equation and to consider what does that mean? What does that mean that I sit here? What is my I guess you could say accountability? What is my ability to respond to being in this position? How do we want to hold it? Do we want to continue to benefit from actions that we no longer align with? And so they ended up contributing to the purchase of this land. And actually, two of my children also are holding land reunion of their own. Each of them are separate in a way, but I think they're all moving with the same spirit. So for me, I guess that's a very active kind of jubilee. And there's, you know, at some point in this conversation, for sure, I want to connect this, but I'll just mention it here that, you know, culturally, especially, you know, so I didn't really introduce myself that way, but I'm come by blood. I come from Diné Nation, and so I'll say she'eia tachi inashli aro ashi ibashish chi and ma edish kejne dashanale and class chi dash check what I was done inashli. So I'm letting you know my clan. But I was also adopted into the Lakota spiritual way of life, and this is how I come to have the name Weyakpa Najin Win, Woman Stand Shining. Um, but in that Lakota way, there's this concept, and for many indigenous peoples, there comes this point of the giveaway, and so in at times it is deep. It's like I've watched people give away every single thing, and so there is this. Um, I mean, it's a spirit. We call it a spiritual endeavor. But you know, as I've been thinking about approaching this conversation, I'm going to say it's actually only in alignment with the practical construct of the way Earth is. But we can go into that a little bit more later in this conversation. But I wanted to introduce that here and give Ian a chance to say what he would say about his relationship to Jubilee. Thank you.
Shamati, hearing you. Thank you. Manora Hamakom Haze. How awesome, how sacred is this space? Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, sisters. Thank you, Pat. I'm grateful for the land here that's beneath the concrete, where my feet are. Tovangar, the ancestral homelands of the sagebrush, and Hunar the bear, and Tongva Tam, Tongva people. This place where my ancestors moved in the 1940s. And I feel like I most know Jubilee in the experience of Shabbat. Once a week, the most important holiday in our tradition, which is 1/7 of a Shemitah or sabbatical year, which is 1/7 of a Jubilee. And so this practice of 25 hours of soul rest, prefigurative time of the world that could be, for me has been a deep form of healing and experimentation in practicing Jubilee, in sharing what is not mine, and really listening well to the land beneath me, and trying to be in right relationship where I am as a Kui or Ger or guest here in Tabangar. And that is a sacred opportunity. And that each week I get to prepare for Shabbat. Every moment is a form of preparation for being in this time. And in the experience of preparing for Shabbat, I'm aware of the times where I'm not preparing for Shabbat and it lands and I'm not able to be held in the medicine that it is. And the most recent sort of like larger scale experience of Jubilee that I'm holding with me in my heart is before 2022, which was the last Shemitah or sabbatical year. I was working with Jewish guests here in Tabangar who whose family had commodified land in Altadena, and she said that she learned growing up about the Nazi Holocaust, but never learned about the Holocaust of peoples and lands of the place where she grew up in Southern California. And with that reckoning, she thought it was a rightful form of repair to donate that land. And so with that connection to the Shemitah year, a large crew of us and a big team of people supported a local group of Tongva Tam who were converging to create the Tongva Tarahat Pahava Conservancy, which is the first Tongva land trust in Southern California. And over the course of a couple of years, the land transitioned to Tongva stewardship during the Shemitah year. And initially that story was full of Jubilee, that people were able to breathe well, have ceremony there for the first time in over 150 years on their ancestral homelands, that we were removing non-native plants and local native moms and their kids were able to live there. All of that is Jubilee for all beings in this place. And being able to breathe that in each Shabbat and light the candles of that form of liberation for me was and is still a form of liberation. And also to take Jubilee seriously for me now in a different spiral of time, timeless time, is to be honest about the preparation that didn't happen before that land transitioned. And the importance of preparation for Jubilee, for Shabbat, for Shemitah, for repair. And I want to honor one of my teachers, Rabbi Lynn Gottlieb, who reminds me and others that nothing is stolen, nothing that is stolen counts as a gift. And so the preparation for this time and practice meant there being over 20 tons of junk that was left on this land, literal asbestos oven mitts, toxins, over 100 eucalyptus trees that were brought here without their consent and put here as cinder blocks that could burn up in fires. 3 audits that the organization had to do because that's what nonprofit organizations have to do, even if they're receiving rightful returns of land under colonial systems. And all of that got in the way of the exhale during the receiving and didn't really leave for space for that shared breath of Jubilee. And knowing now what I know, there is so much preparation that I can be doing as someone who is descendant from Jews who fled burning in Eastern Europe to arrive in Treaty 4 territory in Canada and were used by what was the largest nonprofit in the world in the late 1890s, the Jewish Colonization Association, to settle the ancestral homelands of Cree peoples. Knowing now that I know that, Jubilee for me is what does it look like to prefigure Jewish decolonization associations and how those connect with Mennonite decolonization boards of association and all of these different forms of prophetic practices, and really prepare well. So those eucalyptus trees are tended and removed and created into tinctures that can help people with their breath. And the debts are paid off on that land, and that junk is removed so people can be there and it can be safe, because that land is still not a safe place for people to be in ceremony. And it is a land tax where people can make a guest offering. All of that is swirling at the same time, but it has not been an easy, clear form of repair. It's accompanied so much grief and death and heartbreak. And so I'm with the rocking back and forth of that prayer for Jubilee and what it could look like to really prepare for the giveaway, as Pat was sharing, and knowing the histories of mutual aid societies within so many traditions and the impact of the fires in that place. I can talk about more in a little bit too, but I'll take a couple more breaths and say, Dabarti, thank you.
Shamati. Thank you both for bringing in the various ways that you know Jubilee or have experienced Jubilee. I'd like to take a moment just to step back a little bit. I'm excited to talk about, like, what does it mean to prepare for Jubilee? I really like that question, Ian, as it is such a big part also of the biblical tradition. Is like so much of the instruction is about how do you prepare for these practices in a good way, because you can't just do them. As you know, that can be a recipe for some trouble. But for folks who might be less familiar with Jubilee or these words of Shemitah and Shabbat, I'll share a little bit of grounding about some of these things that we've started to hear about. And I'll share, I was part of a community study group with a good friend, Rabbi Nahum Wardlev, and he was the first person that taught me about this kind of this nesting of tradition that starts with Shabbat and fractals out to Shemitah and Yovel or Jubilee, which are these practices in the Hebrew Bible and also therefore the Christian tradition, if it's drawing on that same scripture. These observances that come in cycles of 7 and are opportunities for practicing release, for relinquishing, for divesting, and ultimately for trusting our relationships, trusting Mother Earth, trusting abundance, trusting God. And they really are, I learned from that study, they're to break the habits of holding on and hoarding that are so central to imperial culture. And they, Shabbat and Shemitah and Yovel or Jubilee invite us into a much more life-giving stance and way of being in relationship with people and with the land, in being in a giveaway, in a mutual giveaway with the world, and in an exhale that actually does let go. And so for folks who are less familiar with Shabbat and Shemitah and Yovel, I'll just briefly say Shabbat, Walter Brueggemann writes that Shabbat is both an act of resistance and alternative to the dominant culture. That rest is the opportunity to transition from a human doing to a human being. And that weekly practice of letting go and just opening up to the fullness of the present moment, and where we move from striving and turn towards gratitude and the goodness of what is. And then these other two practices really build on that. That Shemitah is a rest for the land every 7 years, where all living beings and wild creatures have equal access to what grows on uncultivated land. It's also a time when debts are canceled, and is again this corrective for hoarding and excessive accumulation. And then yovel, as Ian mentioned, and as Pat mentioned, is this 50-year cycle, and seven multitudes of 7 years, which is a biblical full version of reparations. And in Leviticus, this is where a lot of this scripture comes from. The ram's horn is blown to announce that everybody go back to their land, like their original place, to their family, and that the land go back to their original family. And I learned that, while Shemitah was practiced, and obviously Shabbat is widely practiced, Jubilee kind of was this aspiration, and kind of clarifies the cycle of seven, pursuing equity and nurturing a society in which all beings can flourish, and really correcting for this tendency to hoard and these imperial patterns that show up. Ian, you had mentioned really beautifully earlier in another call, that Jubilee is I feel like you summed it up. You're like, it's choosing equity over empire, equity of all beings, equity of the land and ourselves, as part of her. So I'll share, just that as a little bit more grounding, and if there's anything else we want to pull in from where this tradition comes from. Yeah, Ian, do you want to share anything more about just your understanding of where this comes from in the biblical tradition and from a, Jewish practice and perspective?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I'm struck. I was learning a little bit more about Jubilee before this, and that Jubilee sort of originates from Yom Kippur, which is this deep day of atonement and reckoning, where we blast the shofar, ram's horn, as a moment of waking up. And also on that day, we're deepening in our relationship with teshuvah, which is the Hebrew word for repair or return. And some people within my sort of cosmology have talked about how teshuvah, this practice in reparations, was created before the world was created. And that, like, waking up to the returning to the land of our souls is the practice each year, and really each day and each moment. And on that day also is we're preparing for our deaths too. And so it's this braided candle of invitation into what could be, and what a life-giving death could be too. And on that day, we're also prostrating. And so for me, a big way that I've found that I could, in small ways, like kind of embody this form of preparation is through prostration. Even though it's not a big part of current modern day Jewish tradition, it's something that's been practiced for thousands of years in so many different places, is putting my hand and head on the land and listening and exhaling and exhaling and exhaling. And that's what we do each year on Yom Kippur as a form of hakniah, or surrender to what could be. And at the end of the day, this like end of Yom Kippur is joyous, jubilee, huge dancing. And that ceremonial cycle is one that I think, knowing that and feeling that, supports me to know that I can't do it alone. and that it's a collective process. And some of the other sort of texts that are connected to this is this reminder that you shall proclaim release throughout the land for all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you shall return to your holdings, and each of you shall return to your family. And the land shall not be sold beyond reclaim, for the land is mine. You are but stranger residents within me, or gerim tovashim, or temporary guests on the land. And this is this like reminder pretty frequently that we are but guests on this land, and there are 5 different guest laws of how we're supposed to treat and be as guests for those of us who are guests on the lands that we are on, in the Torah or Bible. And they are practices in radical hospitality, choosing equity over empire, recognition of people's basic humanity, and going out and finding people who need hospitality and asking them what they need and following up with that. And it's so clearly connected to the abandonment and hoarding and commodification of land and this creation of the real estate empires that we're living within that have commodified Mama Earth and have abandoned her. And I just, given that it is a Jubilee year within the Catholic Church, I was looking up the connections between death and Jubilee, and when a pope or a major religious figure dies, as has happened in this time, and may his memory be for a jubilee here. It is the time of a vacant seat. So there's the seat has been filled, and also the seat is vacant. And so I'm thinking about all of the vacant lands throughout these lands where I live, where there are 70,000 plus unhoused folks who are living next to them, within them. And so, and there's also the realities of the restrictions of Jubilee and Shemitah being exclusively like invited to be practiced in Palestine, and what it looks like to diasporize this practice, and also pray for a liberation where all beings in Palestine can eat, have more than they need, are able to share in that, in the bread of affliction and liberation. Some of what I'm holding in the framework of Teshuvah, or this framework of reparations, which includes an awareness of harm, admission of harm, truth-telling, listening, reparations, and guarantee of non-repeat. And the prostration when we don't know how to do that. So that's some of what I'm with right now from the texts. And maybe just one more thing that Rabbi Lynn just shared with me is that there's a text, Yossi ben Yochanan said, "Let your house be opened wide, and let the poor be members of your household." So I think that reminder to open up our houses and leave all 4 of our doors open, so people shouldn't have to walk all the way around the house to find the opening, is the text that I'm thinking about as I'm thinking about what Jubilee could feel like right now, alongside sacred boundaries.
Thank you, Ian. I'm really with you in the prostration of Jubilee, especially in this moment, like this political moment, this moment of what is happening in Palestine, the genocide and starvation happening there, while this conversation is happening, and really, outside of the many acts of resistance, also prostration. Yeah. Pat, I felt you brewing, I felt you popping, I felt you perking.
Oof. Yeah. Thank you, Ian. Well, I was really appreciating your phrase. I'm aware of the times I'm not preparing for Shabbat. Like, I'm aware of when I am, and I'm aware of when I'm not. And there's a really big difference between those 2 states of being, and where everything is moving out from. the way, so I'm thinking about that in terms of ceremony, right? So I know when I'm in that place of moving to the ceremony, and then in my modern world, schizophrenia, I guess, moving from one to the other, then I go into some other places where I try to keep that with me, but it wanes a little bit, and then I come back into that fervor, I guess I'll say, and commitment and community to prepare for the ceremonies. And when you were talking about that, the importance of the preparation for them for Jubilee, and as I'm thinking about the ceremonies, the importance of preparing for um, certain ceremonies. So we prepare uh, gifts, we prepare clothing, we start gathering foods. Um, we make uh, larger number of prayers than usual to offer as part of offering. And then for us, oftentimes we go through a purification ceremony. Uh, some people call it, sometimes it's this, not always this, but sometimes it's what many people know as sweat lodge. And in the Lakota tradition, there's a very particular one, Inipi. They're not all the same. But yeah, so every time we step into the ceremony, we want to purify, and that sweat lodge is such a powerful place because, I mean, one of the things it does, I mean, yeah, it literally makes you sweat, right? So you're purifying out your pores in the body and such. There's physically, there's a lot of other things that happen too, I think, but one of the principal things that I notice that happens in there as purification and as preparation is my intellectual, conceptual self gets pushed way to the back of the line. And my physical aspect comes forward first, because of the heat. And so when I'm leading that ceremony, I'll tell people it's going to be hot until this one surrenders. And then when this one surrenders, it won't be as hot. But this one is going to put up a fight, and for some of us, it puts up a bigger fight than others, you know. But those stones and the fire and the water and the earth, they're going to be more powerful than this one, really. So there's a submission too, a surrender, an offering of the self, an offering of will in a way and volition in some ways, or at least allowing something else to step in with us besides just only this individual way of being, right? So there's a big surrender that way, and then there's a surrender. So then after the body surrenders, because the mind has surrendered, then that's when the emotional body comes forward a lot of times, a lot of release. And then the spiritual aspect of who we are, who we can be, who we are in community, not a human community, but then human in community with the elements, and then also what is called into that space becomes apparent at some point in there too. So that's to get ready. That's to get ourselves ready for taking an action that we wouldn't necessarily be able to do easily without those preparations. And so, I want to also think about, sometimes we'll do that before we head into a larger ceremony, or sometimes a multi-day ceremony. And the multi-day ceremony often is about another level of surrender, right? So it's about, I say it's a practice of coming to the end of our own resource. Like we endeavor to do a dance that I say is humanly impossible. You physically cannot do it. And yet you vow with all of your most solemn heart and spirit and soul that you will complete it. So I say it's not possible but under human power alone to do it. The only way that you can complete it is if you're met. You have to be met by the Spirit. You have to be met by this larger community. You have to be met by the human community that's holding this whole thing as well, right? But I'm also thinking about that in terms of the Jubilee. Because to come to the end of your own resource, especially in modern world, right, where we're supposed to be in control, we're supposed to know, we're supposed to, And even as I say, even though it gets proven to us over and over and over that neither of those things are really possible, only temporarily at best, right? And yet we have this rule that if you're a responsible, accountable human being, that you got all that together all the time. So this is a practice of for me, it has been of that release and saying, I'm going to bring it as far as I can, but I'm going to hit that place where I can't. But if you meet me, then I will complete this vow. And so, you brought up trust. I can't remember who of you, but that came up a lot for me around this whole idea of Jubilee. The giving away, the release of debt. Oh my gosh, the return of land, the acknowledging people's lineage. And I mean, especially at this point, as an Indigenous person in modern world paradigm, the acknowledgement of the lineage that is associated with place. Those are all extreme vulnerabilities in modern world paradigm right now, right? Um, because of our indoctrination about what security is. But you know, so so our so as I'm thinking about Jubilee too, and you talked about the real estate building empires or something like that, and I'm like, so this. I think there must be other aspects of it that are not associated only from that framework, right? Like we're looking at it from a lens, especially of the way things have come now. But at other times, that lens of looking at Jubilee had to have been a little different. Because I see that with our own ceremonies. We look at our ceremonies sometimes through the lens of modern world paradigm, but there were other elders who never encountered modern world paradigm looking at the same ceremonies, and they were seeing it through a different place, right? So there's different entryways, I guess. But beyond, whose land is whose, and this is a point that I bring up currently around land back or land reunion, the return of land back to Indigenous stewardship that's taking place in the United States, but other places too. I'm involved with other communities and outside of the United States that are making these moves as well. But it's not just about traditional land use in the way that we think about it. It's also, these different peoples, my peoples, have had a relationship to place as a sustenance, but also being able to contribute to the sustenance of all the life in a place. So that's one aspect, but there's this whole other aspect, which I call it the vertical axis in relationship to place. So the human beings participated in the conversation that takes place between Earth and cosmos, between Earth and Holy Star. So this extends beyond Earth, and even that, I was with the author. I had the pleasure of hosting her here in Taos, Amy Irving, and I was talking about this vertical axis, and she immediately assumed I was talking about the axis going down to the center of the Earth, and I was talking about the axis going out to the cosmos. But there again, that she's exactly right. Of course, the axis that goes down into the heart of this Mother Earth. So to stand for the human part in those larger relationships is key to why the peoples that are associated with place have to, or it would serve everything for them to continue to be able to play that role, to hold those ceremonies, to sing those songs in those places, so that everything thrives, and not just in one area, but the whole earth. As we say, we don't do these ceremonies just for any particular people. It's for all the life, but then also for that relationship of earth to cosmos, right? So this is something that really struck me when I was thinking about Jubilee, especially in terms of return of land, and that's also happening with land back right now, is these relationships and these possibilities for participation in these larger movements have a chance to come back around. So I'll stop there.
Just gonna pull on some threads here. I'm really appreciating this combination of like surrender and preparation, like both of those things. in preparing for ceremony and preparing for the giveaway and preparing for teshuva. There's a lot that's needed. And there's also, you know, as you were naming, Pat, the moment where you're like, I can take it to here, and then I need to be met by spirit. I need to be carried the rest of the way. That trust and that surrender, and it makes me think about in the Leviticus scripture around Jubilee and around Shemitah, like there is the preparation of the years 1 through 6, where you are, you know, storing grain, you are making sure that the people will not starve, and there's only so much you can do, and that there is a promise in the scripture that there will be enough. There will be enough that 6th year, the harvest of that year, to last for years 7, 8, and 9. So not just the Shemitah year, but the 2 years after. So it's this surrender and this faith in abundance and creation, in that conversation that we're having with the horizontal of all beings here on Mother Earth. But I also hear you naming, Pat, like this other conversation that keeps the world turning, between humans and Earth and cosmos. And that's just that feels like an important piece. And also one other thing I want to name is, you know, I think some of the more problematic parts of the scripture, like, you know, have to do with, you know, the treating quite differently an in-group versus an out-group. But what I'm hearing in this scripture of like recognizing people's families and lineages, and that everybody like is kind of returning to this sense of where they come from, is actually a recognition of the importance and the critical nature of all of these cosmologies, of like, it's important that people return to their where they come from in a spiritual sense, so that those conversations can continue, so that those practices can keep the world keep the world alive and thriving. And so that's one thing that I'm hearing too in what you shared, Pat, and reflecting upon on Jubilee. Curious if that brings up anything for either of you. I'm also recognizing there's another piece in some of the scripture in talking about the release of slaves. There's a part, let your kin live by your side as such. And there's this prohibition of treating anyone, treating your kin or anyone who comes under your care in straits, as they say, as slaves. And upon Jubilee, those bound laborers are freed, and they're freed from the bosses and their children too, in perpetuity. And so I'm thinking about the ways in which this scripture is just really really a reset of relations on all fronts, like the vertical, the horizontal, the within your community, within your family, beyond your family, with your neighbors. It feels like this just real recognition that we can get things sideways so quickly, you know, every 7 years or every 49 years. And so we actually need these reminders in time to get into right relations. And, you know, it feels really apparent that, you know, since colonial time started ticking, like we have not. And I feel like we are seeing empire both crumble and assert more and more control. And that there has not been a reset of relations for a very long time, and it feels very acute and acutely needed, Jubilee right now. Those are some of my reflections upon hearing both of you.
Thank you both so much. So much. Sierra, really, Pat, heard you in this preparation so that these practices and ceremonies can have a chance to come back around. Like I heard you that come back around, and that experience of cycle, and what you just shared, Sarah, around our kin being side by side. Feels for me, I grew up in Pacific Palisades and was living there with my family in January when the Palisades fire was happening, and the land that was returned, Huhugna, which means place of the bears, a resting space, is in Altadena. Just having these two sort of ties to what could be Jubilee. For me, has invited reckoning with this text in the Torah Bible of Moses's relationship with the burning bush, of like what it could mean to be ablazed and not consumed. And that kind of as a middle ground in the in-between of timeless time and you know, being in the day-to-day and forgetting to remember that ceremony's on the way, or that ceremony's here, or that repair is here. And also deepening a relationship with the kin like eucalyptus, who are sacred to peoples in many parts of the world and are called invasive. And there's language that's invited as a form of jubilee or liberation to kill them and to destroy them. And I want to learn to be able to love them with all of my heart and all of my soul and all that I belong to and belongs to me, to see them as kinvasive species. They are kin to me. And to me, to treat them with love is to support them to have good deaths. And so I think for me, like where I am is in the time between now and the next Jubilee year, the time between now and the next fire that has brought a portal of what could be in these lands that have been commodified, of decommodified lands, space for rent-free forever housing for folks, community land trusts, supporting traditional embodied ecological knowledge, all of these things that have been here since time immemorial and could happen again and are happening again. I know that there's many forms of hospicing that I need to do to the attachments that I've created to ownership, to control, and I appreciate the invitation within all of these traditions to what that could look like, and I am excited to hospice real estate, to hospice in a way that recognizes this entity that's been created as kin to support a rightful return for all beings who need to return with support in this place too. But
Thank you. So a couple things have been coming up. This whole piece around trust, and you brought up, you know, Sarah, that we're going to trust that there's enough, going to be enough for not just the Jubilee year, but the 2 years after, 3 years. So I've thought about that a lot, not necessarily in relation to the specific topic of Jubilee, but just that, like, what were our lives like? You know, there's a big anthropological assertion that with the coming of agriculture was when hoarding and real estate, and you know, that those two were kind of simultaneous, and that could be. But I'll also say that there were many human beings all around the world who engaged in different kinds of agriculture, not in the way that we always think about it, but cooperation and collaboration for the augmentation of all to have what they needed, including human beings. And I'll just throw in there that my daughter Lila June Johnston, her PhD is on traditional land management practices, so she's going into some really deep examples of where Indigenous peoples had cultivated areas that still stand today. They were aligned with Earth principles, I guess you could say. So that they're still thriving and functioning. And when we take them as being just the way the Earth is, but actually those were cooperation and collaborations. For instance, she says that the rainforests in South America, the lungs of the Earth, were collaborations and co-creations, for instance. And so so I say, I don't know that agriculture in itself, this way of moving with Earth, she calls us human beings keystone species, actually, which is a far cry from what I often say, that we have low self-esteem as a species right now. So many people feel like we're destroyers, and that the Earth would be better off without us. And my answer to that is that maybe, I don't know, but I feel like it's also the flip side of that. The truth is that she can't be everything that she could be without us. So I'm much more interested in the question of who could she be with us than without us. But in any case, going back to the trust, so to move in such a way while still honoring the sovereignty of all beings, that seemed like a really key principle for the peoples that we often term as indigenous. Indigenous meaning long-term family and collaborators of a particular place. And so in order to be that, we were looking at certain principles and laws of Earth, and one of them that has been presented to me is the sovereignty of all beings. So to honor the sovereignty of all beings, there's only so much you can take at a time from any place or anything. So there had to be a level of trust in the cycles, in the relationships, not just the scientific, sterile relationships, but when you're going in deep and having communion in ceremony with the buffalo, and they're giving you songs to sing, and they are giving you insight into how to be a human being here through ceremony. That's another level of relationship. So trust, yes, but also a really deep level of building relationship, such that you know that we're all in collaboration, we're all working together, we're all moving for the same thing, which is life and more life and more life. And so that also, because oftentimes I talk about the sacred hoop of life, and Thich Nhat Hanh calls us interbeing, and one of the things I have to say about in that space, which is different than the way that modern world paradigm is leading us to be anthropocentric. I always have trouble with that word, but I think I got it out. But in order to have this, to really step into the real way and challenge and gift of being interbeing, of being so interrelated, interconnected, that it can't really be done through this intellect only. And I think this is also the problem with Jubilee, or why the practices of Jubilee and such, and even the giveaway sometimes gets neglected, because we've been so herded up into this one modality of knowing. And this one is a strategist, this intellect. It's a strategist, it's problem solving, it's categorizing. And so I think it can only have a certain strategy for how to survive and what those relationships mean. So I'm going to say that here again, I'm finding this place where it seems like we have to expand on the strategy of the intellect and move into the strategies of the whole spectrum of ways of knowing that the human being has, which is the heart and the spirit, and also the somatic experience. Our body is giving us a lot of information about how to be, that in order to survive in the power over paradigm, the modern world paradigm, we have to shut down in order to try to I say we have to lose our humanity in the power over paradigm, but that doesn't work out so well for us. We're seeing the results of that. All this work around trauma, all these modalities for healing trauma, that's not an accident. That's the fallout of enough generations being passed through this pressure cooker of the power over paradigm, that the stress is showing up. It's not just a fad. It's not just a I don't know, the groovy thing. It's a real signal of something that's happening. So the wisdom of not hoarding, the wisdom, because eventually hoarding is going to impinge upon the sovereignty of some being somewhere, right? It has to. You overharvest, you deplete the soil, you withhold from somebody somewhere, right? So anyway, and I guess the last thing I'll say about the trust is, I just remember when my daughter was heading into, we're starting to make preparation for the ceremony of her coming into her womanhood. So they gave me this long list. It's a elaborate ceremony of everything that was going to be required, and but my elder said, so gorgeous. She said, "Now you do need to be collecting these things, but don't go at it too hard. Don't just run around and make sure you got everything, because part of the process for the young woman, it's gonna make me cry, is for her to trust that her community will support her and that they're going to come through with some of these things. And she also needs to know that the spirit and the mystery is also working to support her as the life bringer of the people, that she's going to be met there as well. So let her watch how these things arrive, because that's part of her holding as a woman, backbone of the family, backbone of the community. She has to know and trust that. How incredible is that, right? So there's that teaching of the kind of trust that I think about, that I think we're speaking about here. I'll stop there.
Mm. Mm. Um, well, yeah, I'm just with that invitation to trust and like what that means, what that would cultivate in us and in communities. Um, I guess one question I have, and I feel like you started to speak to this, Pat, of kind of where does Jubilee become possible in us? Like, how does Jubilee become possible in us? And I feel like you're also speaking to, the things that get in the way of Jubilee, like the strategist in particular, the mind, seeking to understand and control and know and categorize, and isn't necessarily an organ of trust. Um, let's just say. I'm curious if both of you could speak to, um, you know, this practice, which, is in Torah and in the Bible, a rhythm of trust, a rhythm of right relationship and realignment, um, as law, as divine teaching. If that is alive and ever evolving, um, with our realities as people. I mean, we've now entered very, you know, uh, robustly into modern world paradigm. Many of us have been shaped by that. What does Jubilee point us towards right now? Um, what's the edge that Jubilee calls us towards, and like what's getting in the way of us doing that? I mean, the United States is one of the most Christian countries in the world, and yet this tradition, which is in the Bible, like is so far away from being seen or practiced. And so I guess it's kind of like, what does this call us to? What part of ourselves does this need to take root in, and what gets in the way of this story, being part of the human story?
I'm still really moved by what you shared, Pat, about your daughter and community. Just thinking as someone who's in a Jewish peace pilgrimage order, how hard it is to feel like I'm in a sacred loop of life. And I really want to watch the arrival of Jubilee. I want to watch the arrival and feel the arrival of repair, of community, of support and trust in that. And as a younger person, it's the constrictions right now feel really alive. So I'm appreciating the possibility of this trust and the practice of this trust, and the one of the core prayers in daily liturgy is the Weyakpa, which is this commandment to love God or the earth or flowing waters, the ocean within us and beneath us and around us with all of our hearts, all of our souls, and all that belongs to us. And so I think that that's one of the things that I feel is a compass for me, is noticing what I belong to, what belongs to me, and how can I love them more fully with others. And that includes right now learning to love the people who have been wealth hoarders, who I know, who I'm in relationship with, and loving the land that's been abandoned by in an anthropocentric word. You got it. I couldn't find it. Someone will find it in some way. But the land that's been abandoned by many humans. And there are so many sites, places that have fences with little like entry points. There's a place three stores down from where I'm staying with a fence with a little hole. And I think some of what I'm feeling pointed toward is entering into that hole, making it a little bit bigger, going in there, removing the concrete that's there, tending to the plants, tending to the soil, seeing if it's a place where the native kin of this place, so I'm in relationship with, would like to burn, to return traditional burning to this land. And if it's a place we can build structures or places for people to live that are with materials from this land. And just knowing what that looks like in our different neighborhoods, in our different villages, in our different communities, and where these places, whether it's retreat centers, and knowing the amazing work that Land Justice Futures has done in cultivating and supporting people to be in rightful return and land relations, thinking about where these churches and spaces of worship and houses that Christian and all types of denominations and faith traditions have commodified could be shifted in ownership, and letting them be again places for all ones of all ages to be able to feel the sacred loop of life, as Pat was sharing, and be in the rhythm of right relationship with aliveness and all that is evolving. And getting the support to do that, and grieving in the whole process, the whole way, and knowing what we need and what prayers we need to be with in this in between where things are and where things could be. Um,
Well, gosh, Sarah, when you first asked that, like what's preventing us, or how could this come about? I was like what's in the way? I'm like, nothing's in the way. Nothing's in the way. Uh, and not to dismiss the things that you're bringing up and that I also encounter, Ian. But ultimately, nothing's in the way. So we have power over paradigm, in which you must have power over another in order to have what you need, has taught us that isolation and hoarding is the best security. And it might be if this were the reality of Earth, but this isn't the reality of Earth. The reality of Earth is highly, highly, highly relational. Um, and This is not. This repels cooperation and collaboration. So for me, and granted, I have the privilege of exiting paradigm A, or maybe paradigm B, or paradigm sub C or something, over here, and I get to go into another paradigm that is more real to me than that one, and that's the paradigm of this sacred hoop of life. So the sacred hoop that has every single life form upon it, where every single member has to uphold their part or the hoop begins to fail. So it's in everybody's best interest for everybody to thrive enough in order to be able to uphold their part, to make their contribution, including the human being. So the human being has a contribution to make to maintain the integrity of this hoop, this interbeing, this interrelatedness, that is so extreme. I mean, no member can do any one thing without affecting the whole. And I feel like, so this is a reality that I feel like large swaths of human beings have known at one time or another. And then we come to times when we want to pretend like that's not real and that we can somehow get around it. The interbeing clause, we can somehow get around it, but we can't. It's just the way this earth is made. Like she's a a single organism, of all these different members, and they all contribute to her well-being and to each other's well-being. So, so for me, I have to depart out of here a lot. And I'm trying to find the words to describe how that happens. It's that whole directive of being in the world but not of the world, and always learning about that. But just on in a quote unquote practical, I mean, there's nothing really more practical than this in my view. But let's just say this is seen as some kind of um, flaky, potentially woo-woo situation. And I'm like, but for me, no. To me, this is what I got to have my eye on all the time, right? And so so just thinking about people who people who have, what I say is that wealth that people hold could have only come from one place. It could only have ever come from this earth. There's nowhere else for it to come from. Or out of the bodies of animals and trees and stones and waters, and out of the psyches and souls of human beings too. So all of that that's being withheld, that's being dammed up, I say that's life being withheld from life. And so at this moment, I feel like the call is that dam has to be released now. Life is calling out for life, and that has to be released. So Jubilee is coming in that form in certain pockets, right? And this is part of this community of reimagining money and protecting the sacred. We're always watching. What does it take to do that? To move against the current of this version of security the version of security that this paradigm calls for? What does it take for us to begin to release that? So, for instance, I was talking to someone who was in charge of a foundation of a large corporation, and they're like, yeah, so I'm part of that, that arm that we have to have where we give away stuff to. We don't only just make money, although we're making a hell of a lot of money, and sorry, a lot of money. And but we got to do this giveaway thing too, and but so we give to nonprofits, and because we have to give to nonprofits. And I was like, well, hold on a second, why do you have to give to nonprofits? See, that's an embedded story that's passed down, and often through the men's line, great grandfather to grandfather to father to son. Now women are more allowed into this amassing game, but I say, you could give money to whoever you want it to. The only reason you don't is because you want the tax break. But if you make the tax break a part of the contribution, then that opens up everything for you to do whatever you want, wherever you want, however you want. And so, why not? Why not? Um, there are land returns that can be gifted, and they are being gifted. Um, Now, what the point you brought up right away, Ian, is that the current structures do not allow for this cooperation and collaboration, legal structures, financial structures. Plus, you got to get through your financial advisors, then you got to get through your legal counsel. And they're telling you, no, 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 this is the rules. This is how you stay safe. It's my job to tell you. So you're going to have to either dismiss them or put your hands over your ears a little bit in order to be able to transition from a superimposed paradigm that's creating scarcity and death all the way around, and transition to a paradigm of relationship and interbeing and interconnectedness, which is the reality of Earth, right? So that, because this power over paradigm thing hasn't been going on forever, we've had long periods of where it was different. I mean, 5,000 years, that's kind of long, but certainly in the last 100 years, it's really amped up in a very particular way, huh? And then think about Indigenous peoples being able to have, I say, if the highest and most sought after technology on the planet is sustainability, who should we be talking to? Well, we should be talking to those peoples who've known how to live in one place for 1,000 years, 5,000 years, 10,000 years, 20,000 years or more in relative health, harmony, and happiness. So we call these people Indigenous peoples, right? And that's why I speak, is because it's not because I want to be add a little cultural flavor to any conversation. That wouldn't be worth it for me. It's to say there is something about this, that part of humanity that still has, it's a library of understanding of how to be a human being here. And the principles that were guiding people to be able to live in a place and cause it to thrive for that long is something that we need to be paying attention to here. So to part of Jubilee for me is the restoration of that place of the very deep science of how to be human of Indigenous peoples. That's pretty critical. And not I'm not just saying that because I am Indigenous. It's just it's only logical. Anyway, I'm kind of getting a little rambly here, but I'll stop there. But there was one thing oh, I wanted to name, I just saw this recently, and it's talking about the seven deadly sins. And it said gluttony was not necessarily talking about overeating. Gluttony was talking about hoarding and withholding. So we, outside of the systems, we can take all kinds of actions, but they're outside of the financial stories, they're outside of the legal stories, which are meant to perpetuate that hoarding. But we're free to take those actions at any time in any place, and that's what the great experiment of this Jubilee community that I started out with is. This is what we mean by reimagining money. We have to confront what are our unconscious agreements that we have with money or land or whatever it is, and where did they come from, and what do we want to do instead? And so what I find is for people to take really big risks, it's really helpful to have a community of support that's also moving in these directions. So I'll stop there.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's part of what we're called to be, is how can we be a community that supports each other in taking the risk of right relationship, of repair. Because in modern world paradigm, it can feel like this is a scary thing to do, even if it is the safest, sanest choice that we could be making at this time in humanity, and in the world. In terms of what else could we be doing? I want to draw out some of the more practical, like what does this look like in these last few minutes of being together? Just what does this look like? I hear, we've talked about, land return. We've talked about the practices of basically healing the land of many of its toxins or invasive species. We've talked about reparations and paying reparations. We mentioned a little bit about the honorary land taxes that support in rematriation efforts and land reunion efforts in different regions. I'm curious if we can just spend a few minutes here talking about what can Jubilee look like right now in our lifetimes? What is that risk? And we'll share some links in the chat as well as we talk. But I wanted to get both of your thoughts on what this can look like in practical terms. Ian, go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Pat. Yeah, nothing is in the way. I want to just affirm that. And affirm as someone who grew up in an owning class household where hoarding became a story that was shared internally but not externally. The experience of sharing the story of repair and meaning and joy and liberation that comes through releasing what is from the earth, the inheritance that I received toward land justice projects, has been a deep form of holding for me. And so I just want to say a part of that withholding is and removal of the hoarding is also sharing these stories of Jubilee is something we can do.
Mm-hmm.
And alongside that is most places throughout Turtle Island have some form of a native land tax where you can support a local native-led organization, tribally led organization. There's the Indigenous Solidarity Funders Coalition that has different land taxes or ways to support. You do not need to have a quote unquote official one to support. You can be in relationship with local native projects and send a check each month that can come financially or through showing up and offering your heart and support. And other experiments could include experimenting with estate planning, where you could deed land at the end of your life if you own land to a person who is from this place where you live. That can happen during your life. Housing experiments, if you have an extra room, experimenting with multi-generational living where people can share together, sharing money that people own, especially in the pre and post experiences of disaster and knowing how disaster capitalism is happening. I want to shine a light on one form of Jubilee that happened amidst this is in Southern Oregon, a community of predominantly Black and Brown residents. After what was called the campfire, pooled the money that they received through FEMA and other institutions to buy a trailer park community, and over 100 residents are now owners of where they live, and no one was owning land before. That organization is called Coalición Fortaleza, and that is an example of what could happen in Southern California. That is an example of what needs to happen in other places. And knowing the legal fictions that we're also working to unwind, to re-enter into the cycle that Pat's speaking to. And I'll also put in the chat some lists of things that a group of Jewish folks who I've been in relationship with dreamed into what a Jewish decolonization association could be doing right now to guarantee non-repeat of colonization and engage in rehabilitation spiritually, restitution, and compensation through interpersonal, personal, and systematic forms of reparations.
Thank you, Ian.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know. For me, I guess I'm just really immersed in this right now. So it feels like everybody's doing this, but I have a feeling everybody's not quite everybody's doing this. Spread the word, first of all. Wow. How can we reimagine money? How can we reimagine um, this earth that supports us all? And how can we protect what is sacred to us and also to all life? Um, so you can talk about this conversation. And then I'm gonna say it's hard to find the people who are willing to navigate the translation between the right relations that is arising between people who are willing to quote unquote take the risks of Jubilee like actions. Um, Although I think ultimately they end up being the deepest security that we could have, contrary to what this is constantly screaming at us. Um, Um, and so to find the people the lawyers, the attorneys who are willing to navigate this moment of being between paradigms, I guess you could say, support them. And if you have financial advisors, ask them questions about this. Well, how do you see, you know, what kind of, how do you see supporting risks that I might take around Jubilee type actions? And if they have no answers, tell them, well, I might have to go find somebody else. Like just to start that thought process within those contexts is really, really important right now, I think. So attorneys, real estate folks, because it's a big question for Indigenous people about how these lands are to be held, uh, because none of them really fit the spirit in which we would want to be in relationship to these spaces that we've had long, as again, thousands of years relationship to before. So I guess I'm thinking about it in that way. Um, yeah, I mean, we're looking to build a place. We're having uh, it's a place for our people to be able to have ceremony that we haven't had before, but it's also something called Joy House, the School for Unlearning, and that's open to everybody. So we're looking to build a bunk and bath house on site over there. So anybody's up for contributing to that, we certainly would welcome that. And yeah, just we're actually kind of creating a corridor of these land reunions coming from southern Colorado down through northern New Mexico, that create, again, a collaboration and cooperation in terms of what we might call agriculture, and remembering and learning. Where is Joy House? Joy House is in our hearts primarily, but Joy House has multiple sites, including up at the site where I'm talking about that I'm taking stewardship on since the end of 2022, but then also coming down through Taos, one of my son's sites, and on. So there's multiple learning sites there. Yeah.
Well, thank you both. I want to lift up a few things named in the chat. We have the Debt Collective, which is a group of a large group of groups that are organizing folks in debt, organizing against medical debt, student debt, fighting for tenants' rights, and really seeing the whole, I would say, like a pretty holistic picture of what we need in terms of like a financial system revolution. We have kind of on the other side of that, the Ancestors and Money cohort led by Morgan Curtis and Justine Epstein, who work with people to think through the responsibilities for the resources that they steward, and connect that with their ancestral legacies. Janelle Orsi put a new legal guide to help with redistributing money in the chat as well. And I think there were also some organizations named around Black land loss and Black family land trusts. And just want to lift those things up as well. Oh, and lastly, there's a call later today on Shemitah and Palestine that Ian had alerted us to, that was also in the chat. If folks are particularly holding this question of what is Jubilee in the context of what's happening in Palestine right now. With that, we are a little bit over time. I would just love to first thank our speakers. Pat and Ian, thank you so much for being here, for offering your wisdom, your perspective, your time, your hearts, and all of these words that you've shared. And I want to thank all of you for joining as well. I'm going to leave some questions in the chat. We were hoping to have a little bit of time for people to reflect on them, but now I'm just going to offer them to you now. Maybe you can think about them for as you move through your day. But holding these questions of what's enough and what's too much, and where can Jubilee be alive in my life, in my community, in the place that I live, and hoping that you all that this conversation be in service of life in all the places that you are. With that, yeah, any last words? Thank you, Pat and Ian, so much. And if not, we'll have everyone say goodbye and come off mute if they like.
Just want to say thank you for hosting this conversation.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.